All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name's Tom, and I'm here to talk to you about a jolly web typesetting adventure. I'm the lead front-end developer at a studio called Thick. We're a service design agency, and we have a focus on making positive social impact. So, typography on the web. Why should we care? So, this is basically about the users. So I think when we're building web interfaces, we really need to squeeze every last bit of accessibility out of the content that we're designing for. So this is really about how to convey sort of a strong hierarchy of information in the browser. Wise man once said that the web is 95% typography. So we, as developers, we spend a lot of time setting type on the web, and I think we probably don't talk about it quite as much as we probably should. So here I've just got just an example of that really, trying to demonstrate there's a lot of type on this page. You know, a couple of little images, a couple of icons sort of scattered about, but generally it's just sort of mostly type. So here's our medium as well, same sort of thing going on. I'm just going to adjust that slightly. So grids are one way that we can really bring structure to our type. This has been around for quite a long time. There's a lot of sort of thought about this long before the web even existed. And I think this is a book from 1961. And the thing you might notice about these little sort of grids that they're drawing up here are that these kind of look a little bit like they could be web interfaces. So that's quite interesting. Sorry, I'm going to pause here and just adjust this very slightly. All right, that's a little bit better. So when we're talking about grids, usually on the web, we're talking about columns. Generally, you've got your sort of 960 grid, or your sort of bootstrappy style sort of grid. It's generally about columns going down the page. And I think to support typography, we often want to focus a bit more on a baseline grid. For anybody who doesn't know, a baseline grid is basically what's going on here is the lines that go underneath the baseline of the type. So basically where those grid lines are running, that's the baseline of text. And this really stands out when you've got multiple columns, especially on an interface. So how do we build these? How do we set up a baseline grid on the web? I think CSS line height really sucks at this. It adds a little bit of vertical space around your text, which is just a little bit weird. I'm going to kind of refer to this as the spooky box throughout the rest of this talk, which is, to me, this is sort of what margins should be for. And we don't really have a lot of control over how this space is set up without actually changing the line height itself of our text. So I think what this illustrates is developers and designers are speaking really different languages. There's not really a concept for the space outside of the web. I don't think designers, when they're looking at type, are really kind of taking this space into account or thinking about it. It's just not something that exists outside of the browser, really. So at Thick, we've been using a little artifact to communicate between sort of the design space and development. This is a little excerpt here from a recent project. Well, sort of from a recent project. Yeah, this is really high fidelity, and we usually get this from a couple of different breakpoints on a responsive site. And this generally sets out like your font size, your line heights, all your margins, and things like that. And what you're going to notice about this is that that spooky box is really absent from the spec. It's not really something that that I think is getting designed into anything. So I've kind of come to think that it'd be really helpful if we could eliminate this spooky box in development, so that we can sort of develop based on exactly these the spec that we've got here. Ooh. All right. Yeah, I don't know about this photo. It's pretty weird. But I'm going to run through a couple of like notable tools that are out there that are sort of trying to solve this problem. So, how many of you are familiar with Compass? It's a little bit older. I think a lot of developers sort of cut their teeth on this concept of vertical rhythm through this vertical rhythm module that was part of Compass. What I really liked about this was it made this really simple. You had like a Sass mix-in for for setting up your font size, your line height, your space above and below type, and it kind of set up your type sort of to a grid. Although to me this kind of didn't really work at all, because obviously you can see across multiple columns. I think it's most evident in that top line. The baselines, first of all, they're not on the grid, and they don't actually line up across multiple columns. To me, this is like you had one job, but you're not even really doing that. Yeah. Skipping forward a little bit. A bit more recently, a guy, Jake Giltzoff from Typekit, he built a tool called Sassline. This is quite a good tool. It's really cool. It uses sort of rem units for all of the baseline stuff. And it does a really good job of getting all the type on the baseline grid. Now, the way that it does this is that it takes a really quite detailed config for each of your typefaces that you're using in an application. And what that config uses, most importantly, is a little metric about the cap height of the text. So what do I mean by cap height? The cap height is basically the height of your capital H, or some of your other uppercase letters, ones that don't have a curve that usually goes a little bit above or below that line. And that config would just take a decimal of how much space that would take up out of your line height. So this was a really modern take on it, and it worked quite well. What was a little bit unnatural about it was that you would use a mix-in to set your font size, your line height, all your spacing, and then a little bit weirdly you'd put in a number that fit to the breakpoint that you were speccing your type for. To me, that's a little bit unnatural. That's not really how we write the rest of our CSS. Generally, we'll have a media query or some sort of media query mix-in that we put all of our styles in, and that's sort of the more natural way to write this sort of stuff, I think. So, yeah, based on all of this stuff, I'm going to run through something new that we've been working on at Thick. First of all, before I dive into that, just talk about sort of what we sort of learnt from little bit of an exploration of all these previous tools. So one thing that's really great about Sassline was the use of rems. This is like a really powerful way to set up your typography, because it means that you can take advantage of sort of scaling your interface, which is really quite powerful. If you, for example, if you want to set a layout, set up a whole layout, and then perhaps you have a wider breakpoint and you just want to scale that up, you only have to change one line of code right at the top of the HTML, and that will scale, which is quite nice. Also, EMs are good if you want to scale in that same way in a very sort of localized context. Conversely, of course, we have pixels which aren't flexible at all. So we try to stay away from that when we're using typography. Generally keep this for things that you literally don't want to be flexible. So probably the best example I can think of is like a hairline border that you just don't want to scale up with the rest of your layout in any scenario. Line height is probably best expressed unitless. Guy Eric Mayer wrote a really good article about this many years ago. I'll put a link at the end of this. I'll put these slides online. You can have a read, but it's about sort of the predictability of inheritance. So if you've got an anchor inside a paragraph, this is just going to produce the most predictable inheritance in that case. And these last 2 points are, again, just a little bit about predictability. So if you're using some tool or some mixin to produce some output, you want the output to be a little bit predictable. You want to sort of innately sort of be able to know what you're going to get out of that tool from the input that you plug in. And that last point is probably about working outside of the tool. If you want to modify what you get out of it, you probably want to be able to do that in a predictable way without completely screwing up the rest of its sort of what it's doing on your interface. So that leads us to a tool called Megatype. So this is a Sass library which is open source at the moment. So you can all go out there and start using it, and you can basically import that into your Sass and start using it. So I'm going to run through a very high overview of sort of the config that you would be looking at if you were going to use this, and some of the benefits of using it, and sort of the things you can leverage to really take your typography to the next level. Best way I can describe this is it's basically web typography without that spooky box. This is it in its most simplest form. If you turn off all the really shiny features, this is what you're going to be working with. So this is really great because it lets us work with our designers to basically take that typographic spec and put those numbers straight into our code, and we'll get that straight out as well. All right, so I'm going to do a little demo here. So I'm just going to turn on the debugging, because all these slides are actually written in Megatype. Where was I? Oh, there. So can you see that? It's a little bit. It's a little bit difficult to see. All right, we'll save the demo. I've got another demo coming up. I can probably just show you this part of it. Basically, this is obviously not how the type is set up in. This is not the shape of the actual type elements in the browser. Obviously, the spooky box expands a little bit above and below the type so that it can set up that line height. but there's a little bit of debugging there that will let you see exactly, basically the input that you pop in to that mixin. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off again. Ooh. Okay. All right, so I'm going to dive into the config. So, yeah, following on from that rem scaling stuff that I was talking about a moment ago, if you want your typography to scale at different breakpoints, you can sort of set up a root size in this breakpoint map. And there's a couple of widths there that these will sort of kick in. This lets you, you can basically set up all your type at one mobile first, and then it will scale up at successive breakpoints. So there's a couple of options in here for baseline snapping, which I've talked about a little bit. And the other one I haven't talked about is fluid type. So fluid type is there's a blog post a little while ago about basically setting this up between two set widths and having your type scale smoothly between these two widths to two different sizes. So this seemed like a pretty cool little feature that we could include here. So yeah, this is an option, true or false. You can turn that on, so you can have your type scaling smoothly, or you can just have it snap to a new size. And then obviously the baseline snapping is whether you want to work in that sort of bare bones manner without your spooky box, or whether you want that to actually snap onto your baseline grid. Similarly to Sassline, you need to provide a little bit of a config about your each of your fonts that you're using. So here we've got, what do we got? We've got a sans and a serif. They're font stacks, and then sort of some information about the font weights that are in use, and then there's the cap height there. So the cap height is basically a decimal of how much space that a font takes up if your line height is set to 1, I believe, is right. So yeah, this part just takes a little bit of trial and error. It's pretty easy to set up. This is probably one of the few things that I actually touch when I start a new website with this. Most of the rest is pretty sort of out of the box, I think. So with that set up, you can just go ahead and initialize. It's just calling a mixin called megatype, which basically takes those root sizes from that breakpoint map earlier and applies those to the HTML tag. So those get output as percentages, and then basically all of your rem units will work off of that size. Optionally, just because you are putting in a little bit of information about these breakpoints, I thought it'd be nice to include a little container mixin, so you can optionally have that as well. It's completely optional. Don't need to do that, but you can. So setting your type. So this is sort of probably the central mixin that you would be using if you were to include megatype. It's called Typeset. And this works mobile first. So the top example there, I've included all of the parameters there that you can use. So you need to put in that font variable just so that it has a little bit of information about the cap height. From there, you've got your font size, your line height, your space above or your leader, and your space below or your trailer. So this does a lot of work and sort of behind the scenes to calculate basically how to shift that type onto the baseline if you've got your baseline snapping on. Otherwise, it'll just shift your type so that that spooky box really doesn't factor into the flow of typography on the page. There's also a couple of just media query mixins there that you can use as wrappers around each of your typeset mixins. So in this example, you're starting off with 16 pixels, and that will, if you didn't have any of your media queries, that would scale relative to your root size. But you can override that at any breakpoint with a new size. The other thing I want you to notice is that there's a couple of different formats that you can input your sizes with. So you can use pixels, you can use rems, or you can use a unitless number, which is basically your baseline units. So that's sort of a 1 is every 1 row of your baseline grid. This is a little excerpt, just those first few breakpoints of basically what you get out from that input. And these will take whatever you put in. So if you put rems in, pixels, or a baseline unit, you'll get them out in those sort of best practices that I mentioned earlier. So the other thing to notice is that we're using a CSS top to shift that type to get rid of that spooky box. So the interesting thing about using relative positioning is that it doesn't upset the rest of your layout at all. It will just shift that up or down. And then basically based on the space below information that you give to that mixin, it will sort of compensate for everything below. The other thing about this is that we're trying to get rid of the need to really worry about collapsing margins. So when you're setting type, collapsing margins can be a little bit of an issue, especially if you've got negative margins. They can interact in really kind of wacky and unexpected ways. So I think I know Harry Roberts has written about this a little bit in the past, that it's just good to set all your margins in one direction down the page. Just gets rid of the need to worry about that aspect of setting type. And yeah, so it's up there on GitHub at the moment, and it's an npm and Bower. You can install that and start using it today. All right, a couple more demos. I've got them open, convenient. So this is the basic little megatype demo that we have. So I think I toggle these all on. So that's basically what you get. You know, if you've got all your debugging turned off, you toggle everything on. You get your grid. You get a little bit of information about your root size, and like this is basically the input that I've given, and this is the output. Down here we've got sort of where the breakpoints start and end, and then of course this little bit of visualization of how that type is getting input into that typeset mixin. So question I get asked a lot is like, what are the benefits of sort of this whole type scaling sort of system? So I think if we drag this out, maybe this isn't quite big enough. If I go down, did that just drop? 16, yeah. So you can see this type is all scaling together with that grid. And this is the power of using rems to spec all of your type. And you can imagine if you spec'd your entire, if you spec'd a lot of layout around this as well using rems, you could have a layout that scales as well with this type. And an example of that is at Thick we've recently launched the Smart Traveller website. And so what was really great about using megatype on this is that you can, just going to reset is that a zoom issue? Pop it down. So basically we built this layout here, which is sort of for sort of smaller screens. And then as we're going out and we get to here, this is the exact same layout. And we only had to change that one root size to scale this whole thing up for the screen width, which is, I think this is like a really powerful thing that we can do if we're leveraging typography in this way. All right, so the future. I'm going to note that Star Wars isn't actually in the past, so this is not a great image, but all right, contribute. If you grab this, we're always actively developing this. We've got quite a few sort of little feature requests that we think are like pretty awesome. So we're actively developing this all the time, doing pushes every day, and yeah, it'd be really great to get more people involved. A little bit bigger picture. Kind of asked myself why I even built this. Like, why do we need a solution for type like this? Makes me wonder if maybe our browser spec is incomplete. Looking at sort of the way that line height works and the extra space that gets put around your type really just seems like it might be something that needs a lot more work. And I kind of imagine a world where perhaps referencing your cap height, you don't have to put this into a config. You can just go into your browser and do some arithmetic, you know, on various different typographic dimensions. So that would be cool. And I basically wrote this blog post about all of this, and then somebody came to me with a response, and turns out there is actually cap height in a recommendation. It's a little bit old, but never really went anywhere. And this thing is pretty amazing. Like, it's full of information about X heights, cap heights, descenders, ascenders, all this crazy type sort of information. And it just never really happened. So it's something for us, I think, all of us to sort of think about is like, how can we make the web better? Like, can we build a better browser, you know? So yeah, just to close, I think really I want everyone to kind of put me out of a job. So yeah, everyone should, I think we should be talking about this a lot more and really pushing the limits of the spec that we're building CSS with. So yeah, that's about it. Thanks everyone.